finally found you after 10 years, she whispered to the mafia boss who didn't remember her. The rain fell on Greywater City like a curtain of liquid neon. It slicked the asphalt until the streets mirrored the bruised purple sky, a sky dominated by the Pharos Tower. The building was a monument of steel and dark glass, a spear aimed at the heavens, and the seat of Gino Bianchetti. They called him the Ledger King, a man who didn't rule with bullets, but with manifests and shipping schedules that could make entire economies bleed. Tonight, the tower's private lobby hummed with the sterile efficiency of expensive security. The air smelled of ozone from the scanners and the faint, citrusy polish used on the marble floors. Aria Quinn stepped through the final checkpoint, her heels clicking with a confidence she didn't feel. Her heart was a trapped bird, beating against the cage of her ribs, a frantic rhythm entirely at odds with the polished, easy smile she wore. It was the smile of a public relations specialist, a crisis manager, a fixer. It was a lie. She tracked his approach by the sudden tensing of the guards, the way their focus sharpened from general awareness to a single point. He moved without sound, a man who had mastered the art of occupying space without disturbing the air around him. Gino Bianchetti was taller than her memory served, his suit a charcoal gray so dark it was almost black, tailored to fit shoulders that carried the weight of an empire. As he passed, flanked by his security chief, Aria moved. It was a fluid, practiced motion, intercepting his path not as a threat, but as an assistant. She leaned in, tilting her head as if offering a vital piece of strategy, her voice pitched just low enough for him and him alone. "I finally found you after 10 years. The words hung in the air between them, swallowed by the lobby's cavernous echo. Gino Bianchetti stopped. He didn't turn his whole body, just his head, an economical pivot of muscle and bone. His eyes, the color of wet stone, settled on her. There was no flicker of recognition, no spark of memory, no warmth, nothing. He looked at her as if she were an entry on a balance sheet he couldn't immediately place. His gaze was cold, analytical, and sharp as a newly honed knife. Aria held her breath, her PR smile frozen in place. He was close enough now that she could smell the fine Italian leather of his gloves, still damp from the rain, and the faint, clean, metallic scent of the titanium watch on his wrist. He was appraising her, not as a woman, not even as a person, but as a problem or an asset. Beside him, a woman with hair pulled into a severe knot watched the interaction, her eyes missing nothing. This was Mara Vex, his infamous head of security. Her posture was coiled steel, and her gaze was even less forgiving than her boss's. She was already noting Aria's height, her weight, the way her hand had almost, but not quite, brushed his arm. Aria didn't wait for him to dismiss her. She pulled back, her professional mask sliding perfectly into place. "Aria Quinn," she introduced herself, her voice crisp. "I'm the consultant you requested, the one who handles delicate public perception." She offered a half-truth, the one that had gotten her through the door. "You have a hearing with the Port Commerce Standards Committee in 31 days. Right now. They believe you're leveraging your logistics monopoly to control the harbor. My job is to convince them you are an innovator, not a predator." She paused, letting the stakes settle. "To do that, I need access, full access, to every shipping contract, every partner agreement, and every personnel file from the last 5 years. Gino's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed fractionally. He was calculating the cost. Far below them in the tower's climate-controlled sub-basement, a different kind of calculation was happening. Evan Locke, the group's calm and meticulous chief financial officer, slid a thin, black ledger into a biometric safe. It contained the real numbers, the ones that never touched the official books. These numbers detailed the ghost shipments at Pier 27B and the quiet, massive payments to a surveillance tech firm called Sentinel Bridge. Back in the lobby, Gino made his decision. The silence stretched, tightened, and then he spoke. His voice was a low rasp, like gravel pouring over silk. 30 days, he corrected her. Not 31. You get your access. Arya felt a dangerous surge of triumph, but she kept her expression neutral. But there are conditions, he continued, taking a half step closer. The sheer intimidation rolling off him was a physical force. You don't work from an office. You work near me. You eat when I eat. You will be in my sight. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then snapped back to her eyes. And you don't lie. Not about anything. You lied to me once. Arya Quinn, and this contract is over. And you will be, too. The threat was delivered as casually as a weather report. Arya Quinn swallowed, the motion thick in her throat. She tasted the phantom bitterness of old fear and the sharp, metallic tang of a memory. A silver coin, heavy in a small hand, a dark alley soaked in rain, just like this. A promise whispered by a boy whose face she could no longer quite recall, but whose eyes she now saw staring back at her. Understood, Mr. Bianchetti, she said. Gino, he corrected her again. If you're going to fix my life, you will use my name. Mara Vex stepped forward and gestured to the private elevator, its steel doors gleaming under the cold lights. This way, Miss Quinn. Arya nodded and stepped into the glass and steel box, Gino following close behind her. As the doors slid shut, sealing her inside with him, she caught a glimpse of the city spread out below. The rain lashed against the tower's skin. From somewhere deep in the concrete canyons of the street, the lonely, mournful sound of a saxophone drifted up from a club called the Violet Crawl. It sounded like a warning, as if the entire city knew she had just stepped into a game that would burn away every lie she had, starting with her name. The elevator began to climb, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that there was no way out but through him. The glass-walled room Gino had assigned her was less an office and more a gilded cage, suspended 40 stories above the city and directly adjacent to his own penthouse suite. Her access was a fire hose of encrypted data routed to a hardened laptop that monitored her every keystroke. For 3 days, she barely slept. Living inside the digital architecture of the Bianchetti empire, she dissected shipping contracts thick with legal jargon, debt portfolios that snaked across continents, and endless hours of security footage from the harbor cams. It was a digital labyrinth designed to exhaust and confuse, but Arya moved through it with a surgeon's precision. She wasn't just reading files. She was looking for a heartbeat, a wound, a place where the numbers bled. She found it on the second day, a fractional anomaly in fuel invoicing, small enough to be a rounding error, consistent enough to be a pattern. She pulled the thread. It led her to a series of escalating payments, masked as port maintenance fees. Funneling to a shell company, Halcyon Ridge LLC, the company was a ghost, incorporated in Delaware with no assets and no employees. Arya dug into the incorporation documents, peeling back 3 layers of corporate law until she found the digital signatory on the original wire transfer. It was sloppy, an oversight, but it was there. Evan Locke, the immaculate, composed CFO. The money didn't stop at Halcyon Ridge. It took a sharp, clean right turn, routing through a Cayman account before vanishing completely into the accounts of Norcross Terminal. Norcross was listed on the city books as a defunct, condemned bonded warehouse. Yet, according to the data she'd accessed, its utility consumption was high enough to power a small factory. It was a black site, right on the water. Arya pivoted, targeting Locke's private server logs. Most were sanitized, but she found a corrupted archive file from 6 months prior. She spent 4 hours rebuilding it, byte by byte. It wasn't a ledger. It was a single-line memo. Confirm OSR kite authorization for Norcross. OSR, the acronym landed like a punch to her solar plexus. Office of Strategic Racketeering, a phantom agency, rumored to be a nexus of private military contractors and federal ambition, specializing in operations the government couldn't officially sanction. Kite, a project name, a target, a payload. This was not about shady port contracts. This was a war she hadn't known was being fought. The sterile, blue-white light of the monitor blurred. The scent of polished wood and filtered air in the penthouse faded, replaced by the memory of damp concrete and the sharp tang of low tide. 10 years ago, she wasn't Aria Quinn. Crisis manager, she was June, a 14-year-old runaway with nothing but terror in her belly, cornered at the old Greywater bus terminal. 2 men. Their smiles, like dirty knives, were promising her a warm meal. She knew the price. Then, a boy. He couldn't have been more than 18, but he moved with a weary stillness that felt ancient. He didn't raise his voice, didn't draw a weapon, he just spoke. His voice low and certain, and the men backed away, vanishing into the rain-soaked shadows. He'd taken her to a dry alcove under the pier, shared a stolen blanket, and for one night, she'd been safe. As the sun rose, turning the gray water to bronze, he pressed something heavy and cool into her palm, a silver coin, worn smooth, stamped with the image of a lighthouse. "Lighthouses don't move," he'd said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "They just stand. You stand." He was gone before she could ask his name. A throat cleared, dragging her back. Gino stood in the doorway, his suit jacket off, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He was holding 2 cups of coffee. He'd been watching her. "You look like you're a million miles away," he observed, his voice a low rumble. He walked in, his presence sucking the air from the room, and set 1 cup on her desk. "Just a data ghost," she lied, the transition seamless, her professional mask snapped back on. "Mr. Locke's accounting methods are creative." Gino didn't sit. He leaned against the edge of her desk, caging her in. This was his routine. He tested her constantly, probing for weaknesses, not in her data, but in her. He wasn't interrogating her. He was assessing his new asset. "Tell me about the committee chairman," he said, ignoring her comment about Locke. "What's his vice?" "He doesn't have one," Aria replied instantly. "Not a conventional one. He's clean, but his wife collects pre-Columbian art, and his son's biotech startup is failing. He's looking for legacy, not cash." Gino absorbed this, his stone-colored eyes searching hers. He was analyzing her body language, the cadence of her voice, her pupil dilation. He was testing the product he had allowed into his home. Aria met his gaze. Her posture relaxed, her breathing even. She passed the test, but her heart, that stupid, traitorous muscle, hammered a painful rhythm against her ribs. He was looking at Aria, but she was seeing the boy who had saved June. Later that evening, she overheard Mara Vex speaking to him in the hall. "She's too good, Gino. Her credentials are real. Her cover is clean, but her performance is implausible. She found the Halcyon link in under 48 hours. My internal team has been sniffing that trail for 6 months and found nothing. She's not a PR consultant. She's something else." Aria held her breath. She heard Gino's reply, muffled by the thick glass. "I know. That's why she's still here." She ignored the implication and finalized her report. It was a brilliant, clean strategy. Reroute 20% of Bianchetti's shipping lines, publicly terminate contracts with 3 high-risk third-party haulers, and donate a new loading crane to the Port Authority as a gesture of goodwill. It was the perfect solution to the public problem. It was also the perfect cover for her real investigation. Gino read the 4-page summary in silence. He nodded once. "Good. You'll present this at the internal logistics meeting tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. That was her reward, deeper access. The meeting was held in the main boardroom. Evan Locke sat at Gino's right hand, his composure absolute. Mara Vex stood against the far wall, a silent sentinel. Aria presented her plan with flawless confidence. The executives debated. But Aria was no longer looking at them. She was looking at the main screen, at the massive, complex flowchart of the entire Bianchetti cargo operation. And there, hidden in the data stream she hadn't had access to before, she saw it, a repeating pattern, refrigerated containers, reefers, logged as empty, running circular, nonsensical routes. They were routed from Sentinel Bridge, to Norcross Terminal and back again. Ghost ships in the digital ocean. It was a signature, a method of making cargo or people invisible to all known audits. The bait, she thought. As she smiled and fielded a question about press timelines, the bait is no longer hidden. It's floating right on the surface. The only question is, am I the one fishing, or is someone else? The neon lights of the Harbor Lights Parade turned the falling rain into a colorful, liquid confetti, painting the streets in hues of electric blue and poison green. The boardwalk was a shoulder-to-shoulder mass of bodies, the air loud with synthesized music and the smell of wet pavement and fried dough. Gino Bianchetti's presence cut through the crowd with surgical precision. He moved inside a diamond formation of his protection detail. Mara Vex at the point. Aria walked beside Gino, encased in the same sterile bubble of security. This was her idea, a piece of her humanizing PR strategy, the Ledger King, patron of the city's favorite festival. It happened exactly as the parade's flagship, a boat shaped like a kraken, shot fireworks from its deck. The sound was almost identical, a rapid succession of high-pitched pops, dismissed by the crowd as part of the show. Aria knew better. They weren't fireworks, they were flares, launched from an adjacent rooftop to mask thermal signatures. The real noise, the heavy thump-thump-thump of suppressed rounds hitting metal, came a split second later. The lead SUV, the decoy vehicle just ahead of them, fishtailed, its reinforced windows spiderwebbed, and it plowed sideways into a row of vendor stalls. Chaos erupted. The crowd screamed, a wave of panic radiating outward. Mara Vex was already shouting into her comms. Alpha compromised hard contact. Rooftop east. Gino reached for his own sidearm, but Aria was already moving. She didn't follow protocol. She didn't drop back to the armored follow car. She grabbed the front of Gino's expensive cashmere coat, her fingers twisting in the fabric, and hauled him sideways, away from his guards. "No," he snarled, resisting her pull. "They bracketed the cars," she yelled over the noise, her voice raw. She shoved him behind a large, gaudy stall selling cotton candy. They crashed against the flimsy plywood, the smell of sugar overwhelming. She ripped a heavy, flashing LED sign from its mooring and shoved it into his hands. "Hold this high." "What the hell are you—" "It scrambles their night vision. Keep it angled at the roof." Aria dropped to one knee, her eyes scanning the dark skyline, ignoring the panicked civilians streaming past them. Her mind was a cold, clear processor. The attack was too precise. Flares, suppressors, multiple teams. "There," she snapped, pointing. A-frame roof. Fourth window from the left. I saw the glint. Gino didn't question her. He lowered the sign just enough to speak into his cufflink, his voice a low, lethal command. "Mara, A-frame, fourth window, terminate." A single, clean rifle shot echoed from the street, one of Mara's counter-snipers. The threat from that window vanished, but gunfire erupted from a new location, ground level, pinning them. "This way!" Aria grabbed his arm again, pulling him toward a dark service alley between two warehouses. They ran, low and fast, the sound of rounds chipping the brick behind them. She slammed her shoulder against a steel loading door marked Cranberry and Company. The lock burst, and they fell inside, tumbling into the frigid darkness. The door slammed shut, cutting off the sirens and the screams, plunging them into absolute silence. The only light came from a single, flickering emergency bulb far down a long corridor of towering steel shelves. The air was frigid, thick with the sharp, sweet-sour scent of cranberries and old wood. Their breathing was ragged, clouds of white fog pluming in front of their faces. Gino leaned heavily against a pallet, his hand clamped to his upper arm. Dark fluid dripped between his fingers. "You're hit," Aria stated. It wasn't a question. "It's a graze," he bit out, his teeth clenched. "A graze bleeds." She moved to him, shrugging off her own jacket and pulling a small, vacuum-sealed trauma kit from its inner pocket. He stiffened as she approached, his entire body coiling. "I'm fine." "You're not," she retorted, her voice devoid of its PR polish. It was the flat, cold voice of someone who had done this before. "Hold still or you'll bleed out while looking tough." She didn't wait for permission. She pushed his hand away and ripped his shirt sleeve open. The wound was a shallow, angry furrow across his bicep. Her hands were shaking, a fine tremor from the adrenaline dump, but her movements were economical and sure. She unsealed a packet of coagulant gauze and pressed it hard into the wound. Gino hissed, a sharp intake of breath, but he didn't move. He just watched her. His eyes, dark and analytical, tracked her efficient motions in the dim light. "Your file said crisis management, he said, his voice a low rasp. "It didn't mention battlefield medicine or spotting snipers. Who taught you to move like that?" Arya focused on securing the pressure bandage, her fingers wrapping the tape with practiced speed. You learn a lot when you have nothing to lose. That's not an answer. She met his gaze. The fear was gone, replaced by an exhaustion that seemed years older than her face. Magnets and fire escapes. "Gino," she said softly, "I learned that bad things are like magnets. They pull you in whether you like it or not, so you better damn well know where the fire escapes are." A metallic scrape echoed from the far end of the warehouse. A shadow detached itself from the shelving, the last shooter, who had circled around to the rear entrance. Before Arya could react, Gino moved. He shoved her hard behind a massive wooden crate, stepping directly into the aisle and firing 2 rounds from the pistol he now held. The shots were deafening. The shooter stumbled back, raising his rifle. Gino was exposed, using himself as bait. Arya saw the tactical error in a flash. The shooter was braced. Gino was not. She didn't hesitate. She burst from behind the crate, not at the shooter, but at the wall. She grabbed a long, heavy iron pallet hook and swung it in a low, vicious arc. The shooter, distracted by Gino, never saw her. The hook slammed into the back of his knees, buckling his legs. He cried out as he fell, and Arya drove the heavy handle of the hook down onto his wrist, shattering the bone. His rifle skittered uselessly across the concrete. The man howled, clutching his ruined wrist. The warehouse door burst open, flooding the aisle with light. Mara Vex and 2 of her team swept in, weapons raised, freezing at the scene. Gino standing tall, pistol still aimed, the gunman writhing on the floor, and Arya standing over him, the iron hook still gripped tight in her hand. A beat of stunned silence. Then the high, piercing wail of the building's fire alarm, triggered by the gunfire, kicked in. Gino slowly lowered his weapon. He looked at the neutralized threat, then at Arya, her chest heaving, her knuckles white. He walked toward her, his boots loud on the concrete. He stopped directly in front of her. She didn't flinch, just met his gaze, defiant. He reached out, his gloved hand closing gently over her wrist, right where her pulse hammered against her skin. His thumb stroked the vein. Once. It wasn't an interrogation. It wasn't a threat. It was a silent, stunned acknowledgement. The drive back to the Pharaoh's Tower was tense. The armored SUV, smelling of leather and ozone, cut through the rain-swept streets. Arya stared out the side window, watching the city's neon lights bleed into the wet glass. The adrenaline had faded, leaving her hands shaking again. Gino sat beside her, a wall of silence. He hadn't spoken since they left the warehouse. As the tower loomed into view, he finally broke the quiet, his voice so low it was almost a rumble beneath the sound of the tires. "The smell of rain on your hair," he murmured, his gaze lost in the city outside. "It's familiar." Arya closed her eyes. Her heart, which had just found a steady rhythm, lurched. She kept her face turned toward the window, refusing to let him see the crack in her armor. Hurricane Ebbing 9 hit Greywater City with the force of a battering ram. It wasn't just rain. It was a horizontal assault, driven by winds that screamed like grieving ghosts. The Pharaoh's Tower, built to withstand anything, groaned under the pressure. Then, with a sudden, anticlimactic sigh, The power grid for the entire downtown waterfront collapsed. The penthouse plunged into an oppressive darkness, the only light coming from the emergency strobes in the hallway. Gino's voice cut through the black. "Mara, status." Her voice came back over his comm, tinny and strained. "Backup generators are flooded. The whole district is dark. We're blind down here. Gino." Arya felt a primal surge of panic, the kind that came from being trapped in the dark. Gino's hand found her arm, his grip firm, grounding. "Not here," he said, his voice close to her ear. "We're moving." He didn't lead her to the emergency stairs. He led her to a private elevator she hadn't known existed, one that ran on a dedicated hydraulic system. They descended 20 floors in a stomach-dropping, silent fall, emerging into a high-end parking garage. He guided her to a black, unassuming sedan that was anything but. "Where are we going?" she asked as the armored car pushed through the flooded streets, its headlights cutting tunnels through the sheeting rain. "Garnet Loft," he said, "an old safe house, off the grid, analog." The loft was a converted pre-war warehouse in the old packing district, its massive, floor-to-ceiling windows rattling violently against the storm. The space was cavernous, smelling of old leather, wood smoke, and dust. True to his word, it was analog. Gino lit a row of thick, amber-colored pillar candles, their flames casting dancing, warm shadows over the heavy wooden furniture. The only sound was the relentless, percussive roar of the rain and wind against the glass. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey into 2 heavy crystal glasses and handed one to her. She took it, her hands still shaking. They stood by the massive window, 2 small figures watching the biblical deluge try to tear their city apart. The silence stretched, filled only by the storm. Arya shivered, the damp chill of the night finally penetrating her defenses. It was more than the cold. It was the adrenaline crash from the attack, the vulnerability of the blackout. Gino, who had been watching the storm, turned his gaze to her. He saw the tremor in her hands, the way her shoulders were hunched. Without a word, he stripped off his heavy wool greatcoat, the one he'd put on in the car, and draped it over her shoulders. It was impossibly heavy, a weighted blanket of fine wool and leather, and it smelled distinctly of him sandalwood, expensive tobacco, and that faint, metallic scent of rain on titanium. His fingers brushed her collarbone as he settled the coat, an accidental, grazing touch, a small, sharp jolt of electricity, a static shock, passed from his skin to hers. Her breath hitched. He let his hand linger for a second too long, his thumb resting on the delicate bone, before pulling away. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and rough, as if dredged from somewhere deep. "I have rules, Arya, principles. They're the only things that separate me from the animals I hunt." He turned to face the window, but his words were for her. "No human trafficking, no leverage against families, and I don't ever touch children. That's not my business. It's my enemy." The confession hung in the air, raw and absolute. It was delivered with a blunt, guttural honesty that struck her harder than a physical blow. It was the truth, and the most dangerous part was that she wanted, desperately, to believe him. As if summoned by his words, a deafening crack of thunder exploded directly overhead. The entire loft vibrated, the glass windows bowing inward. Arya cried out, a small, involuntary sound, and spun away from the window, her body reacting on pure instinct, seeking cover. She spun directly into him. He was there, standing right behind her, a solid wall of heat and muscle. His hands came up to grip her arms, steadying her. The whiskey glass dropped from her nerveless fingers, shattering on the old wooden floor, but neither of them noticed. She was pressed against his chest, the heavy coat still tangled around her. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart against her cheek. The storm outside vanished. The world contracted to the few inches of space between them. She tilted her head back, slowly. He looked down. His eyes, in the flickering candlelight, were no longer stone. They were dark, turbulent pools reflecting the amber light. They were breathing the same air. his exhale warming her face. He lowered his head, his motion achingly slow, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision, a flash fire of all the tension, the fear, the suspicion, and the strange magnetic pull that had throbbed between them since the moment she'd stepped into his lobby. It was hunger and desperation, a bruising press of lips. Then, just as quickly, the fire banked, the kiss slowed, softened, and deepened. It became an exploration. His lips moved over hers with a deliberate, questioning pressure. One of his hands slid from her arm up to her neck, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. The other hand found the small of her back, pulling her closer, fitting her body against his. The heavy wool coat slithered from her shoulders, pooling unheeded at their feet. The cold air of the loft immediately hit her skin, raising goosebumps along her arms and back, but where his hands touched, she was warm. She broke the kiss, gasping for breath, but kept her forehead pressed against his. Her voice was a ragged whisper. "Stop! Stop if you want to!" His answer was a low rumble, his own breathing unsteady. "Only if you don't want this." It was the clearest permission she'd ever been given. She replied by rising on her toes and capturing his mouth again, this time with a certainty that matched his. His hands were a paradox of control and reverence. They moved over her, but stayed in safe harbors, her waist, her back, the sharp crest of her hip. His touch was firm, anchoring, a promise of security, not a threat. There was no fumbling, no frantic rush for skin. It was a slow, mutual claiming. He kissed her jaw, her throat, the sensitive spot just below her ear, and all the while his hands held her as if she were made of the same fragile glass as the window behind them. She threaded her fingers into his thick hair, her own touch just as deliberate. This was not the boy from the pier. This was a man, dangerous and complicated. But in this moment, he was hers. He lifted her easily, and she wrapped her legs around his waist. He carried her from the main room, his mouth never leaving hers. The door to the bedroom clicked shut, and the candle flames on the far table danced wildly in the sudden draft, casting their shadows on an empty room. Much later, tangled in heavy linen sheets, the storm reduced to a steady drum of rain. The silence was different. It was warm, sated. Gino lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, one arm draped over his eyes. "Some nights I don't sleep," he said, his voice quiet in the dark. "I just lie awake and count the foghorns from the harbor, one after another, just to prove the world is still out there." Aria, curled against his side, her head resting on his chest, felt the confession settle over her. She was so close to telling him everything. "I was there 10 years ago. I heard those same foghorns." She opened her mouth, the words "I was June" on the tip of her tongue. Instead, she bit her bottom lip, tasting him, and held the secret. She would keep it, just for one more day, just until the morning. The night in the loft had changed the air between them. It was no longer just employer and consultant, or captor and captive. It was something more complicated, a shared secret in the quiet hours. But daylight brought the game back into sharp focus. The storm had passed, leaving the city washed clean, the sunlight sharp and unforgiving. Gino's trust was a physical thing, a currency he had just minted. He placed it on the table of his penthouse office. "Pier 27 BI, he said, his voice all business. The wound on his arm was bandaged cleanly beneath his shirt. "You found the halcyon payments. You see the problem. Now, solve it." This was the real test. He wasn't asking her to fix his PR. He was asking her to launder his most problematic asset. "The problem isn't the pier, Gino. It's the partner," Aria replied, sliding a file across his glass desk. "Sentinel Bridge. They're the ones routing the ghost containers. If you want to clean the pier, you have to clean them." "And how do you propose I do that?" "You don't," Aria said, her PR smile clicking into place. "I do. They're a tech company. I'm a PR consultant. I'll go to them under the guise of exploring a synergistic technology partnership. We want to license their tracking software to legitimize our entire shipping line." Gino's lip quirked. "You're going to walk in their front door and lie to their face." "I'm going to walk in and offer them a bigger slice of the pie, wrapped in a legitimate contract. The greedier they are, the more they'll talk." The headquarters for Sentinel Bridge was a sterile cube of frosted glass and white marble. Its CEO, Silas Creed, met her in a boardroom that felt more like an operating theater. He was a man with a politician's perfect teeth and the dead, patient eyes of a shark. Aria laid out the bait. "Mr. Bianchetti is moving toward full transparency. He sees Sentinel Bridge as a key partner in that transition. Your tracking software, integrated across our entire fleet, would make his operations the most legitimate and verifiable on the eastern seaboard." Creed's smile was a thin, predatory line. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "That's an ambitious proposal. Miss Quinn, a partnership of that scale would require deep integration, full access to our mutual systems." "Of course," Aria said, matching his smile. "That's the point. A transparent, legal, and very profitable venture for both of you." He nodded, but his eyes were not on her. They were on the clock behind her head, as if he were counting down to something she couldn't see. "I'll have my people draw up a preliminary framework," he said, the hook taken. The fallout was immediate. 2 days later, Evan Locke approached her, his usual calm demeanor looking strained. He held a tablet. "Miss Quinn, in light of this new partnership, Mr. Creed's team is requesting we sign an expanded digital security protocol, just a formality, to protect our shared data." Aria took the tablet. It was a dense, 30-page legal document. "I'll review it and get back to you. Evan." "It's rather time-sensitive," he pushed, his politeness a little too sharp. In her office, Aria tore the document apart, not the legal text, but its digital metadata. And there, buried in the file's edit history, was the tag she'd been hunting for: OSR Kite Trap. It wasn't a security protocol. It was a Trojan horse. It was designed to give Sentinel Bridge and their OSR partners a legal backdoor into the entire Bianchetti network. Right under the guise of a partnership she had initiated, they were using her as the weapon. Her blood ran cold. She was about to call Gino when Mara Vex appeared at her door, silent as a shadow. She didn't speak, just slid a grainy, black and white surveillance photo onto her desk. It was Aria, walking into a coffee shop that morning, but in the background, a man in a plain baseball cap was watching her, his face angled toward the camera. He was unremarkable in every way, except for the coiled, patient energy of a predator. "Who is he?" Aria asked, her voice low. "His name is Rook Hain," Mara replied, her voice flat. "He's OSR's top enforcer. He doesn't tail people. Miss Quinn, he marks them for disposal. He's been on you since your meeting with Creed." The walls were closing in. That night, Gino threw her another curveball, a test of loyalty. "Put on something dark," he said. "We have a meeting." The meeting was in the back room of a dockside bar that smelled of stale beer and rust. 3 men sat at a table, their faces hard, their suits cheap. This was the Obsidian Key, a black market consortium that ran the harbor's underbelly. "My new consultant," Gino introduced her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. It felt less like a romantic gesture and more like a man holding a leash. "She has questions about your container manifests." The largest man laughed. "We don't deal with PR Bianchetti." "She's not PR," Gino said, his voice like cold steel. "She's the ledger." Aria stepped forward. She didn't have to fake her confidence. She was furious. "You've been running dummy containers," she said, her voice cutting through the smoke. "Sentinel Bridge has been paying you to lose 10% of their cargo, which you then reroute. The problem is, you're getting sloppy. Your faked logs don't match the port's energy draw. You're charging them for refrigerated units you never plugged in." The man's smile vanished. "So here's the new deal," Aria continued, her pace quickening. "You're going to give us the real schedule, all of it, in exchange. Mr. Bianchetti will forget to mention your little side business to Silas Creed, who I imagine would be very unhappy to learn his partners are stealing from him. She had flipped the entire power dynamic. The men, trapped, looked at Gino, who just smiled. They folded in under 3 minutes. Back at the Pharaoh's penthouse, the adrenaline of the confrontation still singing in her veins. Aria spread the new manifests across Gino's desk. She took a blue ink pen and began to draw lines, connecting the dots, the routes from Obsidian Key, the ghost shipments from Sentinel Bridge, the payments from Halcyon Ridge. It wasn't a web. It was a single, undeniable arrow. Every corrupt dollar, every missing container, every fake log pointed to one place, Norcross Terminal. "You have a leak in your boardroom, Gino," she said, her voice quiet. "A big one." Gino stared at the map she had drawn, his face a mask of cold fury. Evan Locke. He said the name like a curse. "He's been working with OSR from the beginning, the Sentinel Bridge partnership, the security document. It was all a trap, and they're using me to spring it." Gino looked up from the desk, his stone-colored eyes meeting hers. The air crackled. "And I'm supposed to trust you? A woman who lied her way into my house. You want me to trust you over the man who's been my CFO for 10 years? Aria didn't flinch. She leaned forward, placing her palm flat on the desk, just inches from his. "You already do," she whispered. "You proved it by asking that question instead of having Mara put a bullet in my head." His gaze dropped to her hand. He slowly, deliberately, covered it with his own. The warmth of his skin, the callous strength in his grip, was a silent contract. The moment was shattered by a sharp buzz. Gino's private phone, the one on his desk. He looked at the screen, his face hardening. He thumbed the message open, read it, and then went perfectly, terribly still. "What is it?" Aria breathed. He looked up at her, and all the warmth, all the trust was gone, replaced by the Arctic cold of the Ledger King. "It's from the U.S. Attorney's Office," he said, his voice flat. "OSR just filed a temporary injunction. All Bianchetti assets are frozen, pending investigation, based on evidence provided by a confidential informant." The endgame had just begun. The news of the asset freeze hit the room like a sonic boom, creating a vacuum of stunned silence. Gino's hand was still covering hers on the desk, but the warmth was gone. It was just pressure now. "They used the PR angle," Aria said, her voice a strained whisper, her mind racing. "They used my meeting with Creed as the evidence of collusion. Evan fed them a narrative." Gino pulled his hand back. He didn't look at her. He looked at the skyline, his jaw so tight it looked carved from granite. "Mara, get Evan Locke now. No excuses." He spoke into his comms, his voice lethally calm. "I need to find the original OSR file," Aria said, standing up, her own adrenaline surging. "The one I found the kite reference in, if I can prove they had this plan before I ever met Creed." "The archive room is in the sub-basement," he said, still not looking at her. "Mara's team will be sweeping the building. Go, find it." The archive room was a stark contrast to the penthouse. It was a cold, windowless vault filled with rows of rolling metal shelves, smelling of old paper and server ozone. It was the physical backup of his entire empire, the hard copies the Ledger King kept. She moved with frantic energy, pulling server logs and binders, her mind screaming at her for being so blind. She had been the tool. She had been the weapon. Her hands were clumsy, shaking with rage and a deeper, colder fear. She fumbled a stack of files, sending them scattering. As she bent to retrieve them, her hand brushed the pocket of the jacket she'd worn since the safe house. Something small, round and heavy, fell from the pocket. It hit the polished concrete floor, not with a clatter, but with the dull, heavy sound of old silver. It spun, a dizzying silver blur, wobbling across the floor. It rolled in a slow, dying arc and came to a perfect, silent stop directly beside the toe of a polished black Italian leather shoe. Gino stood in the doorway, watching her. He hadn't made a sound. He bent down, a slow, fluid motion, and picked up the coin. He didn't look at it, not at first. He just held it, his gaze fixed on her. Then he opened his palm. The silver disc sat there, gleaming dully under the harsh fluorescent lights, worn smooth by a decade in her pocket. But the image was still clear, a solitary lighthouse, beaming its light. The air left the room. Gino's expression, the hard mask of the Ledger King, fractured. It was a terrifying thing to watch. He stared at the coin, and his head gave a small, involuntary shake, as if trying to dislodge a memory. He looked up at her, and his eyes were no longer cold stone. They were lost, confused, and filled with a dawning horror. "The rain," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "The bus station, the blanket, June." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Aria felt the careful, constructed identity of Aria Quinn shatter like glass. The tears she had held back for 10 years burned in her throat, making it impossible to speak. She could only nod, a single jerky motion. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice a low, ragged rasp. He took a step toward her. I was June," she finally managed, the name feeling alien and true on her tongue. She took a ragged breath, the confession pouring out of her. "They found me after you left. The traffickers. But I got away. I was picked up by the marshals. I was a witness." She was rambling, the words tumbling over each other. "They put me in the Witness SafeNet initiative. Aria Quinn isn't real. They gave me a new name, a new face, a new life. They buried June so deep no one could ever find her, so they could never find her." Gino took a half step back, the motion one of pure, instinctual recoil. The coin was still clutched in his fist. He looked at her, truly looked at her, searching the lines of her face for the girl he remembered, finding only the ghost of her in the eyes. "Why?" His voice was tight, vibrating with a suppressed emotion she couldn't name. It wasn't just anger. It was betrayal, so profound it was visceral. "Why come back? Why here? Why me?" "Because of you," she cried, the tears finally breaking free, carving hot tracks through her composure. "And because of Norcross, the network that took me, Gino. They never stopped. They just got smarter. They partnered with OSR. They're using your ships. They're using Sentinel Bridge and Norcross to move people, to move children. I came back to stop them. I came back to find the one man I thought was powerful enough to burn them to the ground." "So you lied." His voice was flat, dead. "I had to—" "You lied," he repeated, louder this time. "From the first word, from the first second you walked into my lobby. I finally found you. That was a lie. No, that was the only truth I told. You came into my life like a file," he snarled, advancing on her, the pain and rage finally erupting. "Like a calculation, a strategy. You analyzed me. You profiled me. You used a 10-year-old memory as a key to unlock my door. You used— that night." He couldn't finish the sentence. He gestured between them, a violent, disgusted motion that encompassed the loft, the storm, the intimacy they had shared. Was that part of the calculation, too? The question struck her like a physical blow. She recoiled, the shame and the truth of his words hitting her. "Yes," she whispered, her honesty a new, sharper kind of blade. "At first, it was all a calculation. I needed you to trust me. I needed the access." She looked him straight in the eye, letting him see the wreckage of her plan. And then it all went off the rails that night in the storm. It stopped being a plan, Gino, and it started being real. "Real." He spat the word, laughing a short, bitter laugh. "Nothing about you is real." The heavy vault door hissed open. Mara Vex stood there, her face grim. She didn't look at Aria, only at Gino. "Boss, the accounts are locked, all of them. And Evan Locke just made a formal proposal to the board. He's citing the injunction, claiming you're a liability. He's proposing a temporary transfer of operational control to save liquidity." "To who?" Gino's voice was arctic. "To our new partners," Mara said, her own voice laced with contempt. Sentinel Bridge. The final piece clicked into place, the trap. It wasn't just to frame him, it was to steal his entire empire. Gino looked from Mara to Arya, and his face closed. The raw emotion, the pain, the flicker of memory, it all vanished. The vault door of his soul slammed shut, locked, and spun. The Ledger King was back. His eyes, when they landed on Arya, were cold, flat, and dead. They were the eyes of a stranger. The eyes of a man looking at a line item that needed to be zeroed out. "Get out, Menacing," he said. The command was so quiet, so devoid of heat, it was terrifying. Arya flinched. "Gino, please, I can fix this. I know the OSR protocols." "I said," he repeated, his voice dropping even lower. "Get out, now. Mara, see her out of the building. Her access is revoked. If I see her again, shoot her on sight." He turned his back on her, walked to a server rack, and began pulling drives, as if she no longer existed. Mara Vex didn't touch Arya. She just tilted her head toward the door. The message was clear. Arya stood frozen for a beat, the entire world collapsing around her. She looked at the man's rigid back, the man she had come to save, the man she had come to. She couldn't even form the word. She turned and walked out of the vault, her steps mechanical. As she passed the doorway, Gino's voice stopped her, but he didn't turn around. "Leave the coin." She looked down. Her hand was clenched so tight her nails had broken the skin. She hadn't even realized she'd taken it from him. Slowly, numbly, she opened her fist. The silver lighthouse lay on her bloody palm. She placed it on the steel doorframe, the metal cold against her skin. Then she walked away, alone, into the hallway, an enemy to the only man who could save her, and a target for the people she had spent her entire life running from. Mara Vex did not just walk her to the lobby. She walked her, with 2 guards, to the revolving doors and pushed her through them. The heavy glass of the Pharaoh's Tower sealed shut at her back. Arya Quinn stood on the pavement, disavowed, her name and face suddenly the biggest liability in Greywater City. She was June again, 14 and running, only this time, she had no one to run to. The narrative war began in less than 10 minutes. Her burner phone, the one she had kept taped beneath her salvaged laptop, buzzed with a city-wide news alert. She didn't have to read it. She could see it, splashed across the massive electronic billboard on the building opposite. Bianchetti insider exposed as Valiente syndicate spy. Below it was her Arya Quinn headshot. Next to a diagram of faked wire transfers, it was Evan Locke's masterpiece, a leaked dossier painting her as a deep-cover operative for Gino's main rival, the Valiant Syndicate. The story was perfect. She had seduced her way into the tower, orchestrated the attack at the parade to gain Gino's trust, and then attempted to frame Evan Locke to seize control for her true masters. It was an execution order. It made her the city's most wanted woman, hunted by OSR, by the Valiant Syndicate, who would be furious at the accusation, and by every loyal Bianchetti soldier looking to curry favor with the new regime. She dropped the phone into a storm drain and pulled her hair back, tucking it into a cheap baseball cap she bought with cash from a street vendor. She had to get off the street. The Aurora Glass Museum was 2 blocks away, a sanctuary of quiet and culture. She paid cash and slipped inside, disappearing into the main exhibit. It was a forest of glass, a labyrinth of massive, spiraling sculptures that refracted the light and the reflections of the patrons. It was a beautiful, disorienting place to be hunted. She saw them first as distorted shapes in a curved blue pillar, 2 men, gray suits, earpieces, not OSR, private contractors. They were fanning out, their movements too quick, too professional for museum-goers. A tourist screamed. It was a muffled sound, cut short, a silenced fit. A glass leaf next to Arya's head exploded into 1,000 glittering shards. Arya didn't run. She moved. She grabbed a heavy, bronze "Do Not Touch" sign from its stanchion and hurled it into a massive, delicate sculpture of a glass willow. The sound was a catastrophic explosion of shattering crystal. The alarm blared. People screamed and ran for the exits. Under the cover of the chaos, Aria vaulted a velvet rope. The first gunman met her in the narrow gap between exhibits. She didn't hesitate. She drove her palm up under his nose, a brutal, upward strike. He went down, his gun clattering. The second man fired, the rounds pinging off the metal framework of the art. Fit, 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 Aria scrambled, low and fast, through the maze of shattered glass. She was cornered, a wall of unbroken crystal in front of her, the gunman closing in. She looked up. A steel maintenance ladder, leading to a catwalk high above the exhibit. She leaped, her fingers catching the lowest rung, and pulled herself up. Her muscles screaming in protest, she ran, her boots clanging on the metal mesh. He was waiting for her at the other end. Rook Hain. He stood silhouetted against the bright skylight, his pistol lowered but ready. He hadn't bothered with the chase. He had simply calculated where she would go. "It's over, Junior," he said, his voice calm. Aria skidded to a stop, her chest heaving. She looked back. The other gunman was climbing the ladder. She was trapped, 50 feet in the air. She looked to her right, a large plate glass window. Below it, the roof of the adjacent building, a new construction site. And stretched between the museum and the site, a thick, black industrial zip line, a remnant of the window installation. It was a suicidal jump. Hain raised his pistol. "Don't." Aria ran. She ran straight at the window, not at Hain. He fired. The bullet zipped past her ear. She leaped, crashing through the tempered glass in an explosion of glittering cubes. She didn't aim for the pulley. She didn't have time. She just leaped for the cable itself, her gloved hands grabbing the thick, greasy steel. The jolt nearly tore her arms from their sockets. She was suspended, swinging wildly, the wind whistling in her ears. She heard another shot, the ping of a bullet striking the cable above her. She hauled herself, hand over hand, a desperate, agonizing crawl. She slammed into the scaffolding of the other building, her ribs cracking against a steel pole. She let go, dropping 10 feet onto a pile of canvas. She didn't feel the pain. She just ran, disappearing into the unfinished building's concrete skeleton. She found the shoreline makerspace at dusk, her body a single, throbbing bruise. It was a chaotic warehouse of hackers, engineers, and bio-artists. She found Nessa Pike in the basement, soldering a motherboard, the air thick with the smell of ozone. Nessa looked up, her holographic goggles pushed onto her forehead. "Aria, damn. The news said you were a spy. You look more like a crash test dummy." "Nessa, Macau," Aria said, her voice a raw gasp. Nessa's playful expression vanished. Macau was the favor, the one Aria had sworn she would never call in. "What do you need?" Aria pulled the encrypted hard drive she had mirrored from the Pharos system. "Sentinel Bridge. I need it decrypted. All of it now." Nessa whistled, low and long. "That's their whole network. This is military-grade encryption. It'll take hours." "We don't have hours." It took 2. Nessa bypassed the final firewall, and the drive's contents spilled across her monitors. It wasn't just ledgers. It was body cam footage. It was audio files. It was unredacted shipping manifests. Aria watched, her blood turning to ice. She saw Evan Locke, Silas Creed, and Rook Hain. They were inside Norcross Terminal. They were walking past rows of sealed containers. Not the refrigerated units, but dark, unpowered ones. The manifests were coded. Damaged goods, juvenile biohazard purge. What is that?" Nessa whispered, her hand over her mouth. "It's how they mark the ones who didn't survive the trip," Aria said, her voice hollow. "It's a logistics code for disposal." She clicked on the last file, a server log. "Nessa, what is this?" "It's a purge command," Nessa said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "It's scheduled to execute. Oh, God, tonight, at midnight, they're initiating a full data wipe of the Norcross servers." Aria stared at the screen, the evidence. The proof that would exonerate Gino and burn OSR to the ground, and it was all set to be erased in less than 3 hours. She had a choice. She could give the drive to Nessa, who could upload it to every dark web journalist and whistleblower on the planet. It would be a nuclear option. It It would expose OSR, Creed, and Evan, but Gino, his assets frozen, his reputation ruined by the spy allegations, would be the perfect scapegoat. They would say he was the kingpin, and she was his disgruntled lover. He would never survive the legal battle. Or she could go back. "Aria," Nessa said, her voice tight. "Give me the word. I can burn this city to the ground with one keystroke." Aria looked at the clock. 9 p. She thought of Gino's face in the archive room, the betrayal, the coldness, shooter on sight. "Make a copy," Aria said, her voice firm. "You keep the original. If you don't hear from me by 1 a.m., you leak it. You leak all of it. Understand?" "And you?" Nessa asked, her eyes wide. "Where are you going?" Aria stood up, her body screaming, but her mind clear. "I'm going back to the Pharaoh's Tower." She stepped out onto the street. The sky above the harbor suddenly exploded in a riot of red and gold, a test run for the new Summerfest fireworks. The booms were deafening, echoing off the skyscrapers. Aria pulled up her hood. The sound of the explosions covered her footsteps as she started to run, a ghost moving against the celebratory crowds, heading straight for the Gray Line Bridge, straight back to the tower of the man who had ordered her death. The fire escape of the Garnet Loft was cold and slick, a skeleton of iron slicked with old rain. Aria's bruised ribs screamed in protest as she hauled herself up the 3 stories, her muscles burning. She had bypassed the Pharaoh's Tower entirely. Gino's kill order had been clear, and she knew his men would obey it. But the loft. This was their analog place. If he was anywhere, if he was thinking, he would be here. The window lock was an old, simple pin and tumbler. It took the ghost of June less than 10 seconds to pick it, the skill returning to her fingers with a familiar, bitter ease. She slid the window open and dropped silently into the cavernous main room. The loft was dark, the candles unlit, the air was cold and still, smelling of dust and wood smoke, but she was not alone. She felt his presence before she saw him, a density in the shadows. He was sitting in the heavy leather armchair, facing the window she had just entered. He had been waiting. On the small table beside his chair, catching the faint, ambient light from the city below, sat his pistol. "You're predictable," Gino's voice rumbled from the darkness. "You always run back to the place you felt safe." "So are you," she rasped, her voice raw. She stepped out of the shadows, her hands raised slightly. "You're still here." He rose slowly, a shadow detaching itself from the larger darkness. He was a wall of muscle and suppressed rage. His eyes, when they caught the light, were unreadable. They were like sheer cliff faces at midnight. "My order was to shoot you on sight, Ene," he stated. His voice was flat, devoid of the warmth she remembered from this very room. "Then shoot me," Aria said. She walked forward, her body aching, and pulled the mirrored hard drive from the waistband of her jeans. She slid it onto the table, right next to the gun. "Or you can watch this first." She didn't wait for his permission. She strode to the loft's high-end entertainment system and plugged the drive into its media port. The large, dark screen on the wall flickered to life. The footage was grainy, the audio tinny from a hidden body cam, but it was undeniable. Evan Locke, his immaculate suit looking rumpled, his face pale and sweating, stood inside the vast concrete echo chamber of Norcross Terminal. He was shaking hands with Silas Creed. The camera panned, lingering on a large whiteboard behind them. Written in bold red marker were the words, OSR Kite, Phase 2, and below that, a server command purge protocol, 0000. "The purge is scheduled for midnight tonight," Aria said, her voice hollow. She pointed to the file directory. "They're not just taking your company, Gino, they're scrubbing the evidence, all of it, the manifests, the body cam files, the OSR payment ledgers. They're erasing the entire trafficking network, and they're using your frozen assets as the cover." Gino stared at the screen, at the face of the man who had been his closest confidant. He watched Evan laugh, watched him point to a container manifest, The betrayal was so absolute, so cold, it seemed to suck the air from the room. A high-pitched whine was the only warning. It was followed by the catastrophic, deafening explosion of the main, floor-to-ceiling window. It didn't just break, it imploded. A tidal wave of pulverized glass and shrapnel ripped through the loft. Gino didn't shout. He moved, in one fluid motion. He crossed the room, grabbed Arya by the waist, and tackled her, wrapping his body around hers as they crashed behind a massive, upturned oak sofa. "Mara," he roared into his comms, his voice muffled by the ringing in his ears. The answer was a series of heavy, metallic thumps, the thick, reinforced steel security shutters, which Arya hadn't even known existed, slammed down over the window frames, cutting off the line of fire and plunging the room into near total darkness. The only light now came from the flickering television screen and the green laser sights of the attackers, already slicing through the dust. "Roof?" Mara's voice crackled over the speaker, strained with the sound of her own gunfire. "Haynes' team. They're in the stairwell too. Boss, they've breached the lobby." The loft's main door splintered, kicked open from its hinges. 3 men in full tactical gear fanned out, their red laser sights dancing across the furniture. Gino shoved his primary pistol across the floor, the one from the table. It skidded to a stop against Arya's hand. "Can you still use one of these?" "Like riding a bicycle," she gasped, her hand closing around the familiar, heavy grip. Gino pulled a second, smaller pistol from a holster on his ankle. He kicked a heavy armchair over, creating a new piece of cover. "On my count." "3," Arya said, rising and firing before he finished. 2 precise shots. The first man in the doorway dropped. Gino was already moving, firing from the other side, a brutal symphony of controlled violence. They fell into an instinctive rhythm, a dance they had never practiced, but somehow both knew by heart. They moved from cover to cover, back toward the bedroom hallway. He fired. She moved. She fired. He moved. They were back to back, breathing the same cordite-laced air, their bodies working as one. Glass from a hallway light fixture shattered, raining down on them. A round chipped the plaster by Arya's head, stinging her face with dust. "If we live through this," Gino said, his voice a low, intense growl, his eyes fixed on the doorway, "we talk. Everything. No more lies." "And if we don't," she panted, ejecting her empty clip. He fired twice, then tossed her a fresh magazine without looking. "Then thank you for the storm." Arya slammed the clip home, a raw, wet laugh escaping her. "Oh, we'll live," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't come this far to die in your hallway, Gino." "Mara," he yelled into his comms. "Extraction where?" "Red Hook Freight Dock, the old elevator, go, go, now," Mara screamed, the sound of an explosion nearly drowning her out. Gino grabbed Arya's arm, and they plunged down the service hallway. They didn't take the stairs. He kicked open a metal door marked maintenance and hauled them both into the darkness of an industrial freight elevator, pulling the steel grate shut just as bullets sparked against it. They dropped 5 floors in a gut-wrenching, unlit fall, crashing to a stop on the loading dock of the Red Hook freight yard. The air was cold, smelling of diesel and the nearby salt of the harbor. Alarms blared, echoing off the stacks of empty containers. They were exposed. "Norcross," Arya panted, pointing into the darkness. "It's 2 piers over. I can get in through the water outflow tunnel." Gino grabbed her, spinning her to face him. His face was streaked with soot, his eyes burning with a terrifying, wild energy. "Arya, June, this is suicide. Hayne will have that place locked down." "It's the only move," she insisted, her voice urgent. "I sent a copy of the drive to a hacker, Nessa Pike. If she doesn't hear from me by 1A_M, she leaks everything. It will burn OSR, but they'll frame you as the kingpin. You'll be the scapegoat, but if I can get inside, if I can stop the purge and live stream this footage from inside Norcross, they can't spin it. It's the only way to save you." "And me," he demanded. "What's my move?" "You cut off the head," she said, her eyes flashing. Evan is expecting you to run. He's not expecting a counterpunch. OSR has your accounts, but not your allies. You call in your markers. You trigger a margin call on his personal finances. You find the capital he used to leverage the OSR deal, and you break it. You make him toxic. You do what the Ledger King does. He stared at her, the comprehension dawning. He wasn't seeing the ghost of June anymore, or the PR consultant. He was seeing a strategist. He didn't speak. He wrapped his hand in her hair, pulled her to him, and kissed her. It was not the slow, exploratory burn of the loft. It was fast, desperate, and bruising. It was a seal, a promise, and a last-ditch plea, all crushed into one searing, breathless moment. He broke it, resting his forehead against hers. "Live," he growled, the word a command. A black sedan screeched into the freight yard, its headlights off. Mara Vex was at the wheel, her face bleeding from a cut over her eye. She looked at Gino, then at Arya, her expression hard. "I'll draw Haynes' team south," Mara said, her voice all business. "They're hunting the spy. I'll give them a ghost to chase. It'll buy you both time." "Mara, no," Gino started. "It's the only move." She cut him off, echoing Arya's own words. She looked past him, her eyes locking with Arya's. It was a silent, profound understanding between two women who knew the cost of this war. "You keep him alive," Mara ordered, her voice flat. "The rest is just noise." Arya gave a single, sharp nod, respect. "Go," Mara yelled. Gino gave Arya one last look, a look that said 1,000 things they didn't have time for, and slid into the passenger seat. The car peeled out, heading south. Arya didn't watch them go. She turned and ran, a dark shape sprinting toward the black water, toward the waiting, murderous mouth of Norcross Terminal. Norcross Terminal was a graveyard of steel, silent and shrouded in a thick, freezing fog rolling off the harbor. The giant gantry cranes were skeletal, black crosses against the bruised purple sky. OSR's perimeter was subtle, a ring of dark, official-looking sedans and a few men in Port Authority jackets turning away non-existent traffic. They called it an emergency safety inspection. It was a lockdown. Arya emerged from the water outflow pipe like a wraith, slick with black water and trembling with cold, but alive with a purpose that burned hotter than any fear. The server core was in a reinforced sub-level. Its entrance, a simple maintenance grate she'd memorized from the building plans. She was inside in under 30 seconds. The room was a humming, refrigerated vault, bathed in the blue-white light of a dozen server racks. The clock on the wall read 11:47 p_M, 13 minutes. She didn't just plug in her drive. She pulled a small, fist-sized drone from her pack, jammed her headset jack into its side, and sent it clattering up a ventilation shaft. It would clear the terminal's roof, activate, and create a decentralized mesh network, a broadcast signal their jammers couldn't block. She jacked her drive into the mainframe. Her fingers flew, bypassing Locke's pathetic security protocols. She routed the signal, not to the dark web, but to the brightest screens in the city, the public media boards at Harbor Steps Plaza. High above the city, on the wind-swept expanse of the Gray Line Viaduct, the tires of Evan Locke's sedan screamed as it swerved, blocked by Gino's heavy armored car parked sideways across the two-lane bridge. Gino stepped out into the night, the wind tearing at his coat. He was a pillar of shadow and rage. Evan stumbled out of his car, his face pale, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of peace. "Gino, thank God, we have to run. OSR, they've gone rogue. They're trying to seize everything." "Stop talking," Gino commanded. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, dead-level sound that cut through the wind. "You built an empire with me on ledgers. Evan, I built it on bone. Did you think I wouldn't know when one of my own was broken?" Evan's composure shattered. The mask of the calm CFO dissolved, revealing the sniveling, terrified man beneath. "You don't understand the new market," he shrieked, his voice hysterical. "It's not about muscle anymore. It's about data stability, OSR, Sentinel Bridge. They're the future I was incorporating the darkness." Gino selling shares in the monster so it would finally be stable. You're a dinosaur, a relic, and I was trying to save your legacy. A convoy of black SUVs screeched to a halt at the far end of the viaduct, their headlights pinning the two men in a harsh, white glare. Doors opened. Silas Creed stepped out, flanked by a dozen OSR operators in full tactical gear. He held up a digital tablet, his smile a thin, white slash in the dark. "Gino Bianchetti," Creed announced, his voice amplified by a small speaker. "By order of the Office of Strategic Racketeering, your assets are seized under emergency protocols. You are trespassing. My men are authorized to use lethal force." He lowered the tablet, his smile widening as he drew his own pistol. "This is the end of the line, old man. A tragic end." He was going to execute him, right here on the bridge. In the Norcross server room, Aria saw it all. The drone she'd sent up had a high-gain microphone. She was watching a live feed from a hacked traffic camera. "Showtime," she whispered. At Harbor Steps Plaza, the giant screens that usually showed ads for soda and tourism flickered, then snapped to a new image, Aria's face, pale and streaked with grime, her eyes burning with intensity. A data overlay scrolled beside her. "My name is Aria Quinn," her voice echoed across the stones, amplified, drawing the late-night crowds. People stopped, their phones rising. "I am broadcasting live from inside Norcross Terminal, Pier 27B, an OSR black site." On the viaduct, Creed's phone buzzed. A panicked aide showed him the screen. His smile vanished. "Shut it down," he screamed. "Shut her down," he aimed his pistol at Gino. "The OSR is currently running a human trafficking ring through this facility," Aria's voice continued, calm and steady as a heartbeat. "I am looking at container manifest 774 Delta. It is marked damaged goods, juvenile, biohazard purge. I am looking at the OSR payroll. Rook Hain, badge number 905, authorized for termination services." A single, muffled shot cracked the air on the viaduct. Rook Hain, who had been moving to flank Gino, suddenly stiffened, a red bloom appearing on his chest. He collapsed. From the steel girders above, Mara Vex dropped to the pavement. Her left shoulder was a bloody ruin, a deliberate choice. She had taken a disabling shot to get close, not a fatal one. She hadn't come for a martyr's death. She had come to do her job. She raised her pistol, her face a mask of grim duty. "Stand down." The OSR team was stunned, their attention split. In the confusion, Evan Locke tried to bolt. Gino moved like a cobra. He grabbed Evan, slamming him against the side of the car, and pressed the muzzle of his pistol under the man's chin, forcing his head back. "Gino, no, please, it was just business." Gino's finger tightened on the trigger. His knuckles were white. He was the Ledger King, and this was the final, brutal accounting. He looked at the traitor, the brother who had broken his house. Then, his gaze flickered to the phone in the dead OSR aide's hand. He could still see Aria's face, her voice still reading the evidence, a beacon in the dark. He released the pressure. "No," he growled, his voice thick with a disgust deeper than hatred. "You won't die by my hand. You'll die by the rules you built." He hauled Evan to his knees just as the first sirens of the Greywater Port Task Force, the real police, forced into action by the dozens of 911 calls from Harbor Steps, flooded the bridge. "The data purge is scheduled for midnight," Aria's voice announced to the city. "In 2 minutes, Silas Creed, CEO of Sentinel Bridge, is initiating it now." In the Norcross server room, Silas himself had appeared, his face a mask of primal panic. He was at a terminal, his fingers flying, trying to manually trigger the wipe. It's locked, Silas," Aria said. She stepped out from behind the rack, her own phone held high, broadcasting his face. The public screens at Harbor Steps switched. Now the entire city was watching Silas Creed frantically trying to destroy evidence. "The system is locked," Aria said, her voice echoing in the room and across the plaza, "and it requires you to read your own authorization command to proceed." Aria's program flashed a document on the screen. On every screen, the original purge order, signed by Silas Creed. He stared, trapped, exposed. His own words read back to him by 1,000 watching strangers. The sirens were no longer distant. They were at the gates, the heavy steel doors of Norcross Terminal. The ones that had hidden the darkness for so long were being battered open, flooding the blackness with the undeniable, righteous light of the law. The dawn broke over Greywater City like a slow, painful bruise. The sky lightened from black to a deep, watery purple, then to a bruised gray. The only sounds on the pier were the cry of gulls and the distant, regular rhythm of the first ferry. The air, scoured by the night's events, smelled only of cold salt and wet, clean concrete. Aria stood on the seawall, her jacket, still damp from the outflow pipe, pulled tight. She watched the water. She didn't hear him approach, but she felt his presence, a familiar, solid warmth at her back. Gino Bianchetti stopped a foot away. His suit was ruined, his hair was matted with sweat and grime, and his face was a mask of profound exhaustion. He looked at her, and for a moment, they were just two survivors on a very long shore. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't offer excuses. He just opened his hand. In his palm, gleaming in the first weak light, sat the silver lighthouse coin. "I remember that night," he said, his voice rough from smoke and shouting. "The rain, the alcove under the pier. I remember June. I've been looking for her for 10 years. And I didn't even see her when she was standing right in front of me." He stepped forward, closing the distance, and gently placed the coin in her palm, his fingers closing hers around it. He didn't let go. He kept his hand over hers, trapping the coin between them. He leaned in, resting his forehead against hers. It was a silent confession, an apology, a plea. She felt the tremor in his hand. "I came back to end it," she whispered, her own voice breaking, "to stop it for the other girls, the ones who didn't get away." "I know," he rumbled, his eyes closed, "but you stayed for me." He paused, his breath warm against her cold skin. "And now I'm starting over, for us." The new headquarters was not a tower of glass. It was a rented space in Harbor House, an old-world building with thick wooden beams, a fireplace, and windows that actually opened. It smelled of old books and lemon oil. It was a place built to last, not just to watch from. They entered, and for the first time, there was no threat. The first thing they did was disarm, not just for the night, but for this new life. Gino's heavy pistol, the one he always carried, was placed on the heavy oak mantel. Aria's borrowed lockpicks and the burner phone from Nessa were placed beside it. Their real phones were set face down, the world and its frantic news cycle shut out. He stood in the middle of the room, looking at her as if seeing her for the first time. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a map of bruises and a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. She was a mirror of his own state. He didn't rush. He walked to her and, in a gesture of profound trust, he held out his hand. She placed hers in it. He laced his fingers through hers, a simple, anchoring touch. He drew her forward, and she came without resistance. The kiss was not the desperate fire of the loft or the frantic seal on the docks. It was slow, deep, and unhurried. It was a question and an answer. It was the taste of survival, the solid, steady rhythm of his heart under her palm, and the safety of his arms closing around her. His hands moved over her back, strong, sure, and deeply respectful, a silent promise of protection, not possession. He held her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones, his eyes memorizing every line. It was a quiet, solemn promise, an acceptance of every part of her, June and Aria both. The bedroom door clicked softly shut, the old house standing guard as they finally, truly, came home. Later, they planned, not as a king and a consultant, but as partners. The Bianchetti name, now cleared by her testimony and his cooperation, would be rebuilt. "Not a shadow empire," he said, staring into the fire. A clean network, a real logistics company, transparent. "We'll do more," Arya said, coming to stand beside him. "We'll start the Lighthouse Bianchetti Fund, a real one financed by all the assets seized from OSR and Sentinel Bridge. We'll fund rescue operations, build safe houses." He looked at her, the admiration in his eyes so clear it made her heart ache. "The Ledger King," he said with a wry, self-deprecating smile, "and his moral compass." The door opened without a knock. Mara Vex stood there, her arm in a fresh black sling, her face bruised but her eyes sharp. She surveyed the scene, the domesticity, the shared coffee cups, the way Gino was standing just a little too close to Arya. A rare, crooked smile touched her lips. "If you two make me be your bridesmaid," she drawled, "I'm demanding hazard pay and a raise." Arya surprised them both by crossing the room and wrapping Mara in a tight, fierce hug. "Thank you, Mara." Mara, unused to the contact, stiffened, then awkwardly patted Arya's back. "Just keep him out of trouble," she grumbled, though her voice was softer. "It's exhausting." The news cycle was brutal. The OSR was being dismantled from the inside out. Sentinel Bridge was bankrupt. Its executives, including Silas Creed, facing a mountain of charges. Evan Locke, his face a mask of ruined pride, had been denied bail. Greywater City was in chaos. The old power structures were gone, leaving a vacuum. Gino stood on the small balcony of Harbor House, watching the harbor lights. The temptation, the pull of the old life, was a tangible thing. "They're gone," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble. "But Greywater hates a vacuum. The tide will come back in. The old associates, the old promises. What if that current pulls me back under?" Arya. She came to stand beside him in the cool night air. She didn't give him false promises. She didn't tell him it would be easy. Instead, she took the silver lighthouse coin from her pocket. She placed it, heavy and cool, into his open palm. "The lighthouse is right here," she said, closing his fingers around it. "It doesn't move. You just have to stand." He looked at the coin, then at her. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, transforming his harsh features. He closed his fist, the metal warming to his skin. He slid his arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his side, tucking her head under his chin. He bent, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, his breath a warm smile she could feel. "I finally found you after 10 years, he whispered. It was not a memory. It was not a greeting. It was a vow, and he sealed it with a kiss, not of fire or desperation, but of quiet, profound certainty. The long, bloody chapter was closed. A new one, proud and real, had just begun. On the balcony railing, the harbor bells chiming in the distance, Gino set the coin on the wooden rail. He flicked it. It spun, a silver blur of chance and memory. Catching the city lights, it wobbled, slowed, and then, in a perfect, impossible defiance of fate, it stood balanced, upright on its edge. The knot, finally, was undone. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We're so curious. Where are you listening from? Please let us know in the comments below. Share your thoughts and subscribe to our channel, Mafia Boss Stories. Be sure to like this video and give us some extra support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.